Hi guys, so if you're watching this as part of Year 10 Remote Learning, then this is what this week looks like for us here. On Monday we don't have lessons, so there's nothing. Tuesday, which is today, we're going to go through the poem London by William Blake. Nothing on Wednesday, and then 2 lessons on Thursday. So we'll be going through an introduction to checking out my history, and then for the second lesson of the day we will be annotating, checking out my history. Friday's a bank holiday, so we will have nothing on there. So for this session you will need a copy of your anthology. You will also need a couple of highlighters and a pen. Let's go. Okay, so last week you should have gone through the video that talks through the context of Blake's poem. Essentially, this poem is the sort of musings of a speaker who we would take to be Blake himself. It might be seen as a character, but Blake is reflecting on the time in which he lived. So he takes a walk through London. The walk brings him near the River Thames, and I think he's quite saddened by this image because he seems to feel as if the course of the River Thames is dictated for it. It's no longer allowed to be free. And then he goes on to see the signs of resignation and sadness in the faces of all of the people that he comes across along his journey. So I already started part annotating this, so it'd be nice and quick for us today. Let's start with the first stanza then. So he says, "I wander through each charted street." Now, I've obviously already highlighted it as a piece of juxtaposition because the idea of wandering as a verb, I'll just pop that in there, the idea of wandering as a verb, it has this suggestion that you're quite free. However, to be charted has this element of control attached to it. You chart a map, so they're sort of very designated routes for you to go. So there seems to be this sort of contradiction in these terms that Blake uses, almost like they suggest that you are free, but you're not because your paths are dictated for you. Now, Blake would have been reacting to the society around him through the sort of inescapable cycles of poverty that he was trying to talk about, and maybe this is reflected in his initial line. I think also it would be a good thing to be aware, especially going for the higher levels, is that a French philosopher, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very famously said that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. And I think that's probably a very interesting gobbet to use when you're talking about this. Man is born free, yet everywhere he is in chains. The idea that we are born. When we are born, we are fresh, we are new, and we have no restraints placed on us. We don't know anything different. However, we are chained by our beliefs, by the government, by society, and actually, no, we're never really free. And I think that actually Blake reacts to some of the things that philosophers like Rousseau were saying. So I think you need to just be aware of the juxtaposition up here. So he says, "I wandered through each charted street near where the charted Thames doth," I said doth then, it's not Shakespeare, "does flow." Now, coming back to the idea of the River Thames has always been a symbol of London. It's a very recognisable image, and here it seems to be the sort of social fabric of the city. And I just wonder why Blake talks about it here. Now, I think that part of the thing here is that he talks about the fact that it was filthy. The charted Thames does flow. The Thames wouldn't really been able to flow because it would have been full of filth that was sort of gathering up in the city. If you've ever been to London and you've looked at the Thames, I mean, it's not the clearest of rivers, but it would have been full of waste, dead bodies, sewage. We know that there were pretty unsanitary conditions in London at this period of writing. So even the sort of most natural, most free symbol of London would have been absolutely contaminated, and this sort of idea seems to penetrate throughout the poem as it goes. The Thames therefore kind of acts as a symbol in reverse, which is what I've written here, which I think you need to be aware of. A symbol in reverse because of the fact that rivers are often symbols of natural beauty and this idea of freedom, that they carve out their own paths and they flow where they need to. But in here, the idea of seeing the Thames full of filth, full of potentially dead bodies, full of sewage, only adds to the sense of misery and limitation and restriction. Even the Thames isn't free. So if this natural this natural river isn't free to go where it pleases, then how on earth would we expect the inhabitants of the city? So it acts as this symbol in reverse. It should be a symbol of a natural, beautiful river, and in fact it just serves to highlight the restriction and the misery, because it's not free itself. Okay, so just be aware of that. You're probably going to want to flesh out those notes just a little bit. You've also got the diacope here, this idea of it being charted, and the diacope, created really by the word's repetition, reflects the way that this cage, now it's not a physical cage, this metaphorical cage, this imprisonment is inescapable. The oppression that was put upon these people was inescapable, and that's what the diacope there helps to reflect. So you're going to need to add this in here. So diacope reflects the confines of citizens. It helps to highlight how trapped people were, and I think that's the effect of the diacope there. You might wish to call that diacopic repetition, and that's absolutely fine, but they're essentially the same thing. Okay, we come through, and the speaker says, "I mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe." Now, very simply, the adjective every shows that this is not something that just affects the few people, this affects the many. And then he goes on to talk about the fact that in these faces he sees marks of weakness and marks of woe. So people are broken down, they feel weak, and woe is sadness. But we've got more than this, and I want to draw your attention over here to this piece of terminology, which you may not have used before. This antonoclassis is repetition where the meaning changes each time you use it. So it's a little bit different to polysemous language, where the poet doesn't seek to use the same word and have a different meaning. Polysemous language is where the poet uses one word but we could interpret it in two different ways. Antonoclassis is where the poet intentionally uses the same word but he uses it in a different way. So here we have marks of weakness, marks of woe, and he marks in every face. So here, mark is seen as a verb. It means to notice. He notices in every face he meets. Then marks of weakness and marks of woe. Now, the effect that has is that he uses, firstly, he marks them, he notices it, and it's used as a verb, and then he sees the marks of weakness, the marks of woe as the nouns, and that becomes quite important. And the use here then of the antonoclassis helps to just develop the sense that everyone is marked by London's oppression. Everyone. There was no escaping it. So all of the people that live there have to suffer, under the conditions that would have been imposed by the government and by higher society. Okay, so everyone was in this sort of melting pot together. So that's really what you need to know there. There is the sense that everyone is marked by oppression. Okay. So do remember, if you're going to use high-level terminology, that you explain the impact that has on the understanding of the poem. That's really important if you're aiming for a grade above a 7, that you actually do that. Okay. So we come through into stanza 2. Actually, no, I just do want to talk to you very, very quickly. I know this is a side note, but if we're going to talk about high-level things, then we do need to talk about this. This adjective charted up here. Now, you might want to look at this, and I'm just going to link it over here. This may well link to Thomas Paine, Rights of Man. Okay, so it's an allusion. It could be a literary allusion. Thomas Paine was an author, and he wrote a book which expressed his strong support for the principles of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution happened, you should know this from the other day, but the French Revolution took place in 1789. And he talks about the fact that he was in support of what the people did, the uprising against the monarchy, the sort of taking their conditions into their own hands. In the book, Thomas Paine makes the remark that potentially Blake has grasped onto when he's been writing this poem. He says, and this is the quotation, "Every chartered town is an aristocratical monopoly of itself. which essentially means that the way in which a city is put together, so the way in which it's laid out, so you've got the dwellings of the sort of regular people all together, all around central hubs, and then you might have a massive palace, or you might have some huge state buildings. The way in which the actual city is put together, that sort of the mapping of the city, reflects the imbalance of power. And what he means by that is that you will have the masses all crammed in together in one tiny little place, and then you've got the mapping that shows that the wealthier people, they might occupy a much larger sort of surface area, but there's so fewer of them. So the power is concentrated in the hands of a small ruling class, and you can see the way in which that's mapped out through sort of the town mapping, that the wealthiest would have been away from the very poorest in there. So I think that you've just got to be aware of that if you're going to go higher, that Blake was hugely political, and he was influenced by the things. He was a very intelligent man, so he would have been influenced, and he would have known about Paine's book Rights of Man. He would have been very acutely aware of the sort of philosophical musings of Rousseau, and he's put them all together to express how he feels against it. And we did talk about in the contextual video that the French Revolution really gave Blake this impetus to write these poems that were informed by this very heavy political backdrop. Okay, so we'll go on then, and we're going down onto line 5 into stanza 2. So here we get this: in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, I highlighted that, in every band, the mind's forged manacles I hear. Now, I mean, you can say what you need to say about it, but you've got this repetition, every, just showing again the fact that this control impacted on everybody who had to live in the city. And it becomes very clear that the speaker feels that something is fundamentally wrong about every single aspect of life in the city, because it affects every single corner, which is why he chooses to use that very simplistic adjective, every, to show that this, what he would have felt was a rotten core, was seeping into everybody's way of life, and it was dominating, and it was impacting on them. Okay, and it just becomes like a domino effect. Something happens, then it rolls into the next thing, and then it sort of makes this misery exacerbated because everybody is suffering from it. Okay, but the line that you can talk about here, the anaphora, every cry, every, the anaphora shows the compacted misery that the inhabitants of London suffered and faced. Okay, going forward, the mind's forged manacles is one of the lines that I want to talk to you about. It's actually taken from your knowledge organiser as well. You've got this idea. A manacle is like a handcuff. It's essentially like a metal band. So these metal handcuffs. Now, what's interesting is that these are mind forged manacles. Usually, what we would think about, if someone was going to be handcuffed or someone was going to have manacles placed on them, they would be placed on them by somebody else. Okay, so for example, if you watch somebody be arrested by the police place the handcuffs on them. Now this says that the mind's forged manacles are here. So we've almost got this idea that the people within the city, they restrict themselves. They handcuff themselves through this sort of oppression that they face, that they have become so I suppose, industrialised, institutionalised, and they realise that they have to modify their behaviour to suit those whom are in power, and they self-regulate, they self-restrict. Now they're not literal, and that's very obvious because they are in the mind, so they're not physical handcuffs. But what they do show is the fact that these manacles are the product of a collective failure of the imagination about how society could and should be. Someone has failed to let people have their freedom. Someone has failed to let these people have a voice, and nobody is supporting them. And I think that's quite a pointed political remark that Blake makes here. Okay, and we come on down into the third stanza. Now the third stanza, if you look carefully, I've highlighted it in yellow for you already. You've got this acrostic that comes down here. And I wonder if this is just an imperative verb. It's concealed very, very cleverly in the poem's form, but it's almost like an imprisoned plea for help. Like it's hidden. But Blake's almost showing that the hidden people, the hidden inhabitants of London, are like, please listen to us, please hear us, please help us. And they were sort of struggling in silence. Nobody could really expose their need for help. So this imprisoned plea for help that asks the reader to acknowledge the level of suffering in London and to respond accordingly. And I think for sort of modern readers now, Blake calls for us to recognise the level of suffering that people did endure within this time period, almost like this veiled warning, like, do not repeat the mistakes of the past. And we hear that quite a lot through literature. You've got he hears this, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Now here Blake decides to draw these images, which are actually specifics of oppression, which is why I've written it here. So, chimney sweepers. The chimney sweepers were just really young boys. Often boys went into the trade of chimney sweeping, as you will be aware, as the church kind of apprenticed them. What that meant was that the church, which is talked about here, the church had this duty. They kind of took people into their care. They were tasked with administering care and accommodation to those who were forgotten by society. So that was most commonly orphans or people who had been abandoned, children who had been abandoned. And the church had sort of parish houses, and they would house them and feed them. Now, probably some of the most famous images from this that you will be aware of are those within Dickens's Oliver Twist. And you will see how Oliver was taken into the parish's care. Okay. But what the church would do, they would try to sort of relieve themselves of some of the pressure. You can imagine how many children maybe would have needed to be cared for by the state. And so they would offer out some of the young boys to industry. And they would say that they were apprentice them. So they'd say, if you take this young child, we will pay you such and such an amount. And the chimney sweepers, they would put themselves in sort of horrific danger day in, day out. And it's economic oppression, therefore, and that's robbing children of their childhood. It forces them into the adult world of work, and therefore they will be exposed to the terrible health problems that came with that job. And I think the point that Blake makes is that the chimney sweepers were the young boys. They were the youngest in society. So this oppression started very, very young. This cycle was ongoing. It was kind of inescapable for a lot of the children who were living in this time period. He then goes on to make this political remark about the every blackening church. Now, there's an oxymoron in that, because we usually think of the church as being this pure symbol of faith and hope. But to be blackening has got this sense of corruption within it. So I think it's worth talking about the oxymoron here. And Blake clearly felt that the church had failed society. The church was not supporting those who needed help the most. It didn't empower them to live free and full, healthy lives at all. And I think Blake implies that the church was part of the problem. We know Blake's own political views. He was very anti-establishment. He didn't believe in the system because he didn't think that it was serving the purpose that it was intending to. Okay, and the hapless soldier's sighs. Now these are all the sort of forgotten people. So the chimney sweepers and the soldiers, and then even down here, the harlots. These are all the people who have been failed by society. These are all of the people who have made sacrifices to society. And they're not supported back at all. Okay, but you've got to be aware of this. So this runs in blood down palace walls. We've got here this political allusion to the French Revolution, which was 1789, which, as we're already aware, and in France, where people rose up against the system, rose up against those who were the ruling classes, and they seized power. Now it almost feels that this is kind of like a veiled threat from Blake, hoping that policy makers and those people who controlled the way in which society worked would be aware. Blake's almost saying, you do know that what happened in France could happen here. if you're not careful, the people will rise up against you. And they've overpowered in France, and they will overpower you. And, you know, lots of people were quite uplifted by this idea that actually the little guys could take power. So I think be aware of that political illusion there. It's like Blake's veiled warning that he goes on through. There's quite a bleak conclusion, really, to the poem, come through down to the very last stanza. But most through midnight streets I hear. Now, the midnight streets, there's a couple of things here. The first suggestion is obviously that they're dark. I always think that midnight's quite a magical time, but it's also a time of witching, the old witching hour, from sort of midnight to 1, if you have read any of fantasy stories as a child. And I think you've got this idea, it carries this suggestion of something sort of supernatural. And maybe that implies that London's oppression is a kind of spell that's been put over the inhabitants by policymakers, or those who run the government, those who were in control. They've been kind of been spellbound by it. And that would also link, and this is what you do need to be doing, that would then link in with the mind-forged manacles up here. That there's all this sort of psychological control, that people had a spell put on them. People had their minds corrupted and controlled, that Blake potentially alludes to here. He talks about the youthful harlot's curse. Youthful harlot is a prostitute. So why are our young women working as prostitutes? Because there is this inescapable cycle of poverty. Prostitution was a huge issue, but it was the only way that people thought that they could find work. But we shouldn't have society which is, you know, tainted by these acts, by the people that were forced into jobs because they had no other option, because they were failed by potentially the church, by people that should have been there to help them. So the youthful harlots who curse and sort of shout about the street, you could also link the cursing to the midnight and the supernatural, that they've got the spell put on them. Blast the newborn infant's tear. There is this cycle of misery that takes place here. It's cyclical. It's never ending. It just feels like it goes on and on and on. Blast the newborn infant's tear. So we've got the most innocent in society alongside those who have been corrupted, who are products of this miserable system. And blights with plagues the marriage hearse. And I mean, that's a pretty vulgar image, isn't it really? It's this almost surreal imagined vehicle that carries love and death together. Almost that there's no separation of the two in a society that is so corrupt. It's an oxymoron. And we always talk about the effect and the impact of using such devices within poetry. That's what we have to do. So Blake's use of the oxymoron here could suggest that love and death become inseparable, that we can't separate the negative from the positive anymore, especially within this society, because there is no escape offered. Everybody is in manacles, these mind-forged manacles. Every man is in chains. You know, quote Rousseau, do something clever with it. But I think, you know, at the end of the day, Blake was trying to show this cycle of oppression that people could not escape from at all if they lived there. So the poem views modern city life as hopelessly oppressive. At this time, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. London was undergoing significant and rapid changes, and the poem therefore, I believe, argues that the changes aren't for the better at all. Instead, the poem acts as a criticism of London, that it didn't actually support its citizens, and actually that the people are the foundations of any society. And I therefore wonder whether this is still a really relevant poem to today, that we have to take care of the people who inhabit the cities rather than the physical cities themselves. Okay, I do just want to talk very, very quickly. This is for the sort of higher level marks that I think we need to get. I just want to talk about metre, so about rhythm, because I think it's a really good point to make for structure. If you look on line 4 here, there is a metrical shift. So I wander through each charted street near where the chart of Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now, this is very rhythmic. The metre changes here. The rhythm changes. so far in lines 1, 2, 3, we have got this iambic tetrameter. And iambic tetrameter is also the meter that is used at the start of Macbeth, okay, where that's trochaic tetrameter, where they say that this is the tetrameter that's important. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? And it's this rhythm that is there. Now, with the witches, it feels like they are chanting, and it's spells, which links into all this supernatural, that the city might be under a spell or a curse. But here it almost reflects the fact that the speaker is walking. It has this sort of sense of somebody walking with a regular pace, because there's a regular beat that happens here. But the rhythm is broken in line 4. It begins with a trochee to make the mark sudden and imposing. So marks of weakness, marks of woe. Okay, so this set rhythm pattern here, marks of weakness, marks of woe, is called a trochee. It makes them sound like they sort of jump out. It's missing a syllable, that line. It has 7, not 8. Marks of weakness is 4, marks of woe is only 3. For it to be regular and to feel that everything is symmetrical and everything is in working order, there would be another syllable on there. Blake disrupts this, and it might be the fact that this shows us that Blake, or the speaker, stumbles, that their rhythm of walking is disrupted, potentially because they are so horrified and they are so shocked by what they see, that their regular walk has been impeded by the images of London that they are presented with as they begin to walk through the charted street. So in terms of the metre, that's something to talk about. So these top 3 here, I will just write it up here for you so that you've got it. 1 to 3, you've got this iambic tetrameter, and then in 4 you have the opening with a trochee. Okay, so you've got this disruption of the rhythm, and then you would need to go on in your analysis to talk about why that disruption of rhythm is so important. Okay, so do make sure that you've got the annotations done. If you've got any other specific questions about this poem at all, please feel free to message me, and I will do what I can to support you with it.